This story was sent to us by one of our subscribers, Alex. When we read it, we couldn't shake the chills it gave us. Alex described a terrifying experience that seems almost impossible, but they swear it happened. Now, we'll let you decide, was it real or just a trick of the mind? Either way, this one will stick with you. It seems I've gone crazy. I'm confused about reality. Who is the real Alex, me or my double? My life wasn't anything extraordinary. I worked a stable office job, lived in a small but comfortable apartment, and spent most of my free time with a few close friends or in my favorite coffee shop a few blocks from work. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Everything had a rhythm, a predictability that made me feel secure. But over the past few weeks, something has shifted. At first, I didn't even notice it. It was so small, so easy to brush off. It started with a coworker, Ryan, who said something in passing during our morning coffee break. "Did you forget something at the cafe earlier? You look like you were in a hurry," he said, smiling. I blinked at him, puzzled. "What cafe? I came straight to work this morning." Ryan laughed. "No, I mean before that. I saw you heading out of Brew Haven around 7:30. I hadn't been at Brew Haven. In fact, I hadn't even left my apartment until nearly 8 o'clock. I told him he must have mistaken me for someone else, and he shrugged it off, but the comment stuck with me. That same afternoon, a client emailed to confirm a meeting that I hadn't scheduled. When I asked about it, they insisted that we had spoken on the phone the day before. But I hadn't. I didn't even remember their name. At first, I chalked it all up to misunderstandings, people misremembering or confusing me with someone else. But that was just the beginning. A few days later, I saw him. I was walking home from the grocery store, my arms weighed down with bags, when I caught a glimpse of someone across the street. He was walking quickly, head down, but there was something about him that made me stop in my tracks. It wasn't just his posture or his clothes. It was something deeper, a feeling I couldn't explain. Then he turned his head slightly, just enough for me to see his face. It was me. I froze, standing there on the sidewalk as cars rushed past. For a second, I thought maybe it was my reflection in the shop windows, distorted by the glass. But no, this man was moving independently, glancing at his phone, tucking his hair behind his ear in the exact way I did when I was nervous. Before I could process it, he slipped into a convenience store. My heart raced. I crossed the street without even looking for traffic, nearly dropping my bags in the process. By the time I pushed open the door of the shop, he was gone. I wandered the aisles, scanning the faces of other shoppers, but none of them were mine. The cashier gave me an odd look as I left empty-handed, muttering an apology. Walking home, I couldn't shake the image. That face, my face, lingered in my mind, like an echo of a dream I couldn't quite remember. But it wasn't a dream. It didn't stop there. The day after I saw him, I started noticing strange things happening around me, little details that didn't add up. A friend, Melissa, called to ask why I'd canceled our coffee plans the night before. "I never canceled," I said, confused. "I thought we were still on for today." She hesitated. "Alex, you texted me yesterday. You said you weren't feeling well." I checked my phone, scrolling through our messages. There it was, a text sent from my number apologizing for canceling. But I didn't write it. Later that week, a coworker stopped by my desk, casually bringing up a conversation we'd supposedly had the day before about a project deadline. I had no idea what he was talking about. "You really don't remember? You seemed off," he said, frowning. "Honestly, I wasn't sure if it was even you at first. You were acting kind of weird. Each time it happened, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was sleepwalking or forgetting things under stress. Maybe Melissa and my coworker were misremembering. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. One night, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. It was an email notification. Someone had logged into my social media account from an unfamiliar device. I scrambled to check it, but the account was fine, nothing out of place. Still, I changed the password just in case. I couldn't shake the paranoia that someone, this man who looked like me, was somehow creeping into my life, slipping into places where I should have been. A week later, everything escalated. I was at work, typing up an email, when my manager, Lauren, stopped by my desk. She looked uncomfortable, like she didn't know how to start. "Alex, can I see you in my office for a minute?" I followed her down the hallway, my stomach sinking. I couldn't think of anything I'd done wrong, but the way she avoided eye contact made my anxiety spike. Once we were in her office, she shut the door and gestured for me to sit. "So," she began, fidgeting with the pen on her desk. "I wanted to touch base about this morning. Are you feeling okay?" "This morning?" I asked, genuinely confused. "What do you mean?" Lauren frowned. "You came in early today, didn't you? Around 7:30? I passed you in the hallway, but you didn't say anything. Honestly, you seemed off. I just wanted to make sure everything's okay." I stared at her, my mind racing. "Lauren, I wasn't here at 7:30. I didn't come in until 8:45. You can check the log." I swiped my badge at the front door. Her frown deepened. "But I saw you. You were wearing that blue shirt with the white stripes, the one you were last week." She was right. I did own that shirt, but it was hanging in my closet at home. I hadn't even worn it that week. Lauren tried to laugh it off, saying maybe she'd been mistaken, but I could tell she didn't believe her own words. I left her office feeling rattled, and when I got back to my desk, I checked the security footage for that morning. What I saw made my skin crawl. The camera showed someone walking into the building at 7:30, someone who looked exactly like me. Same hair, same build, same stride. He was even wearing the blue shirt Lauren had described. But it wasn't me. I rewound the footage and watched again, over and over, hoping I'd notice something off, something that would prove it was a coincidence. But every detail was perfect. It was me, except I wasn't there. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him. Not just the footage of him walking into my office, but the way he moved, his expression, calm, confident, like he belonged there. It was unnerving because I never moved like that. I've always been a little awkward, a little unsure of myself. But he seemed perfect. The next morning, I decided to take control. I got to work early, earlier than I'd ever arrived before. I wanted to make sure I was the first one there, just in case he showed up again. The building was quiet, the kind of stillness that makes every sound seem louder. My footsteps echoed down the empty hallway as I approached my desk. For a moment, I let out a relieved breath. Nothing seemed out of place. But then I noticed something, a coffee cup sitting on my desk. I didn't drink coffee. I hated the stuff. Yet there it was, a steaming cup with my name scrawled across it in black marker. Alex. My hands trembled as I reached for it. The cup was warm, fresh, like it had been placed there only minutes ago. I checked the time, 7:20. No one else was supposed to be in the building yet. My heart pounded as I slowly turned to check behind me, half expecting to see him standing there, watching me. But the hallway was empty. I grabbed the coffee cup and marched to security. "Who else is here right now?" I demanded. The guard, a guy named Chris who I'd known for years, frowned at me. "No one. You're the first one in today." I placed the cup on his desk, then explained this. He looked confused, but he humored me, checking the cameras. We rewound the footage from that morning, and there it was clear as day. At 7:10, the double walked through the front door. He didn't swipe a badge. He didn't hesitate. He just strolled right in, holding the coffee cup. Then he disappeared into the hallway leading to my office. But here's the thing. After that, he didn't leave. Chris checked every angle, every camera, but there was no sign of him coming back out. He had just vanished. After that, I couldn't focus on anything. Work became impossible. Every time someone walked by my desk, I half expected it to be him. The tension was unbearable, and by lunchtime, I decided to leave early. As I walked home, the street seemed quieter than usual. Or maybe it was just my nerves. Every sound, footsteps, passing cars, even birds felt sharper, more intrusive, like the whole world was closing in on me. Then I saw him again. He was standing at the corner near my apartment, leaning casually against a lamppost, as if he'd been waiting for me. His posture was relaxed, but there was something deliberate about the way he stood, like he wanted me to notice him. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. For a long moment, neither of us moved. He didn't say a word. He just stared at me with this faint, knowing smile. It wasn't just that he looked like me. He was me, down to the way his hair fell, the way he tilted his head slightly to the right, like I did when I was lost in thought. But his eyes, they were different. There was a confidence in them, almost a smugness, like he knew something I didn't. I forced myself to move, gripping my bag tightly as I walked past him. My heart pounded with every step, but I didn't dare look back. I could feel his gaze on me the whole time, burning into the back of my neck. When I finally reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me and collapsed onto the couch, my legs trembling. For a moment, I thought I might cry, but the fear was too overwhelming for tears. I sat there for hours, my mind racing with questions. Who was he? How did he know so much about me? And what did he want? Then I noticed something on the counter. It was my blue-striped shirt, the one Lauren had mentioned seeing him wear at work. I hadn't touched it in weeks, but now it was there, folded neatly, as if it had been waiting for me. I didn't touch the shirt at first. I just stared at it, frozen. How had it gotten there? My apartment was locked. There was no way anyone could have come in. I reached out hesitantly, my fingers brushing the fabric. It felt normal, like any other shirt. But as I picked it up, a folded piece of paper slipped out and fluttered to the counter. My throat tightened. I unfolded it slowly, my hands trembling as I read the words scrawled in handwriting identical to mine. "I'm just making things right." That was all it said. No explanation, no signature, just those 6 words. I felt like the walls were closing in. My first instinct was to call someone, anyone, but who would believe me? Even as I sat there holding the note, it felt absurd. A man who looked exactly like me was showing up in my life, walking into my workplace, leaving cryptic messages in my home. It sounded insane. I spent the rest of the night pacing, checking the locks on my doors and windows over and over. I barely slept, jumping at every creak and shadow. The next morning, I decided to take action. I called a locksmith and had all my locks changed. I even asked him about installing a camera in the hallway outside my door. He gave me a strange look, but I didn't care. I just needed to feel safe. For a few days, nothing happened. I started to convince myself that maybe it was over, that whoever he was, whatever he wanted, he had moved on. But then I saw him again. I was at my favorite coffee shop, waiting in line to order, when I spotted him at a table by the window. He was sitting casually, sipping a cup of coffee, flipping through a book like he didn't have a care in the world. The worst part? He looked so at ease, so natural, like he belonged there. I couldn't take it anymore. This time, I marched right up to him. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice low but firm. He looked up at me with that same faint smile, like he'd been expecting me. "I think you already know," he said calmly. "No," I snapped, my hands clenching into fists. "I don't know who you are or what you want, but this needs to stop. Now." He leaned back in his chair, studying me. For a moment, I thought he might actually explain himself, but instead, he just shook his head. "I'm just making things right," he repeated, his voice maddeningly calm. I opened my mouth to say something else, but before I could, he stood up and walked past me, disappearing out the door. By the time I followed, he was gone. After that encounter, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was always nearby, watching me. Every time I left the house, I felt his presence, even if I didn't see him. He didn't need to appear to make his point anymore. He had taken control of my life in ways I couldn't even explain. At work, the rumors started. People who used to greet me warmly now avoided me, their eyes narrowing when I walked by. I overheard whispers, things about me being unreliable or different lately. When I tried to ask what was going on, they gave vague responses or quickly changed the subject. Melissa stopped returning my calls. When I finally saw her outside the office, she looked at me like I was a stranger. "I don't know what's going on with you, Alex," she said, her voice sharp. "You're not the person I thought you were." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I tried to explain, but she cut me off and walked away, leaving me standing there in disbelief. And then there were the things I couldn't explain, things disappearing or showing up in places they shouldn't be. My laptop password stopped working, and when I finally managed to reset it, I found emails in my sent folder that I didn't remember writing. One of them had been sent to Lauren, my manager, apologizing for missing a meeting I knew I hadn't scheduled. It felt like he was erasing me, piece by piece, replacing me with himself. One night, desperate for answers, I decided to follow him. I didn't know if I'd find him, but I had to try. I went to all the places I'd seen him before, the coffee shop, the convenience store, the corner near my apartment. For hours, I wandered the streets, scanning every face, every shadow. Finally, I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the park, under the glow of a street lamp, his hands in his pockets. For a moment, I hesitated, unsure if I should approach him again. But this time, he didn't wait for me to make the first move. He turned and started walking, glancing back just once as if to make sure I was following. I hesitated for only a moment before I followed him. I followed him through the park, my heart pounding with every step. He didn't rush, didn't try to lose me. Instead, he walked calmly, almost leisurely, like he knew I'd follow no matter what. The park was empty, the pathways lit only by dim street lamps. The further we went, the quieter it became, until all I could hear was the sound of my own footsteps echoing his. Finally, he stopped. We were at the edge of the park, near a cluster of old, gnarled trees. Beyond them was a small clearing, bathed in pale moonlight. He stepped into the clearing and turned to face me, his hands still in his pockets, that infuriatingly calm expression on his face. For a moment, I froze. He looked even more like me than before. The tilt of his head, the way his mouth curved ever so slightly. It was like looking in a mirror, but one that reflected a version of me I didn't recognize. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my best effort to stay calm. "What do you want from me?" He tilted his head slightly, as if considering my question. "I told you," he said softly. "I'm just making things right." I clenched my fists, my frustration boiling over. "Right? What does that even mean? You've been messing with my life, my job, my friends. You've ruined everything." He didn't flinch. If anything, he looked amused, like he was watching a child throw a tantrum. "I haven't ruined anything," he said. "I'm just taking back what was already mine." His words sent a chill down my spine. "What are you talking about?" He stepped closer, his voice calm, but laced with something cold, something final. "You know what I mean, Alex. You've been living a lie, pretending to be someone you're not. But that's over now. I'm here to fix it." I shook my head, backing away. "No, you don't get to decide that. This is my life. You don't belong here." He smiled then, a slow, unnerving smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Don't I?" Before I could respond, he stepped back into the shadows of the trees. The darkness seemed to swallow him whole, and within seconds, he was gone. I ran forward, searching the clearing, calling out, but it was no use. He had vanished, leaving me alone under the cold, empty sky. I didn't sleep that night. Every shadow in my apartment felt like him. Every creak of the floorboards made my heart race. I paced the living room until dawn, replaying his words over and over in my mind. "You've been living a lie. I'm here to fix it." What did he mean? What lie? The next morning I called in sick to work. I couldn't face my co-workers, not after everything that had happened. Instead, I stayed in my apartment, obsessing over every detail of the past few weeks, trying to piece it all together. But no matter how hard I thought, I couldn't find a single moment where it all started to unravel. It was like he had been there all along, waiting for the right time to step into my life. Around noon, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email, one I hadn't written. The subject line was blank, but the body contained a single sentence. "Check your drawer." My stomach dropped. I didn't need to ask which drawer he meant. In the desk by my bed, there was a drawer I hadn't opened in years. It was filled with things I didn't want to think about. Old journals, letters, reminders of a time in my life I tried to leave behind. My hands shook as I pulled it open, half expecting it to be empty. But it wasn't. Sitting on top of the pile was a photo I hadn't seen in years. It was of me, or at least it should have been. I remembered the moment it was taken. It was from college, my first year, at a party with friends. We were standing in the backyard, laughing, holding plastic cups. But in the photo, my face wasn't mine. It was his. I dropped the photo like it had burned me, my breath catching in my throat. I rummaged through the drawer, pulling out old notebooks, papers, anything I could find. Over and over, I found traces of him, places where his face replaced mine, notes written in handwriting identical to mine, but in words I didn't recognize. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. Suddenly, my phone buzzed again. Another email. "You're starting to remember now, aren't you?" I stared at the screen, my pulse pounding in my ears. The walls of my apartment felt like they were closing in, the air growing heavier with each passing second. He wasn't just taking over my life. He was trying to prove something, that it had been his all along. I couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. It felt like his presence was everywhere, closing in on me, suffocating me. Grabbing my coat, I fled outside, desperate for fresh air and distance. The streets were unusually quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel like the world is holding its breath. Every face I passed felt unfamiliar, every shadow suspicious. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting him to appear, but the streets stayed empty. I ended up at the park, the same park where I had followed him before. I wasn't sure why I'd come back, but something about the place drew me in. I walked the paths aimlessly, trying to make sense of everything. And then I saw him. He was sitting on a bench near the clearing, his hands resting casually on his knees, as if he had been waiting for me. My chest tightened, but this time I didn't hesitate. I marched straight toward him, anger burning through my fear. "You need to stop this," I said, my voice trembling despite my determination. "Whatever game you're playing, it's over." He looked up at me, that familiar, unnerving smile spreading across his face. "Game," he said, his tone light, almost amused. "This isn't a game, Alex. This is the truth." "No," I snapped. "You're lying. You're not me. You're not part of my life." His expression darkened, the amusement fading. He stood up slowly, towering over me in a way that felt impossible, even though he was my exact height. "You keep telling yourself that," he said, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper. "But deep down, you know I'm right. You've always known." I shook my head, backing away. "What do you want from me?" He stepped closer, closing the distance between us. "I don't want anything. I'm not here to take from you. I'm here to be you." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "You can't just—" "I can," he interrupted. "And I already have. Think about it, Alex. Your friends, your co-workers, they don't even trust you anymore. You're the stranger now, not me. I've been fixing everything you broke, piece by piece. It's mine now." I stared at him, my mind racing. "You're not real," I said, more to myself than to him. "You can't be real." He smiled again, but this time it wasn't smug or amused. It was pitying. "You still don't get it, do you?" Before I could respond, he leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You're the one who doesn't belong here." I felt the ground tilt beneath me, the weight of his words pressing down on my chest. He stepped back, his eyes locked on mine, and for the first time, I saw something in his expression that I hadn't noticed before: certainty. And then, just like before, he turned and walked away. I wanted to follow him, to demand answers, but my legs wouldn't move. I stood there in the middle of the park, paralyzed by the sinking realization that maybe, just maybe, he was right. I didn't go home that night. I couldn't. His words echoed in my mind, and every time I thought about stepping back into my apartment, I felt sick. Instead, I wandered the city until exhaustion forced me to check into a cheap motel on the edge of town. The room was small and smelled faintly of mildew, but it felt safe, or at least safer than anywhere else. I locked the door, checked the windows twice, and pushed a chair under the doorknob for good measure. Finally, I collapsed onto the bed, too drained to think. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, heard his voice. "You're the one who doesn't belong here." At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke to the sound of a knock at the door. It was soft at first, almost hesitant. I sat up, my heart pounding. For a long moment, I didn't move. Then the knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. I crept toward the door, every nerve in my body screaming at me to stay back. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice shaking. Silence. I glanced through the peephole, half expecting to see him standing there, but the hallway was empty. I waited, holding my breath, but the knocking didn't come again. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it must have been a prank or my imagination. But when I turned back to the bed, I froze. Sitting on the nightstand was a folded piece of paper. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it was impossible to ignore. My legs felt like lead as I stepped closer, my hands trembling as I picked it up. "You can't run from the truth, Alex." I dropped the note, my chest tightening as panic set in. The chair was still under the doorknob. The windows were locked. There was no way anyone could have gotten in, and yet, he had. The walls of the motel room seemed to close in around me, the air growing heavier. I needed to leave. Now, grabbing my bag, I fled into the night, not caring where I went as long as it was far away. But no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape the feeling that he was always one step ahead of me. I didn't stop running until I found myself in another part of the city, far from the motel. The streets were deserted, the orange glow of the streetlights stretching long, eerie shadows across the pavement. My chest burned, my legs felt like lead, but I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, convinced I'd see him following me. Finally, I ducked into an all-night diner. It was brightly lit, with a few tired-looking customers hunched over their meals. And for the first time all night, I felt a shred of relief. I slid into a booth near the back, trying to catch my breath. The waitress came over, her expression wary. I must have looked terrible because she hesitated before speaking. "Coffee?" she asked. I nodded, not trusting my voice. She poured me a cup and left without another word. As I sat there, the adrenaline started to fade, and exhaustion hit me like a wave. My hands shook as I gripped the coffee cup, staring blankly out the window at the empty street. Maybe this was it. Maybe I'd lost my mind, and none of this was real. But then I heard it. "Long night?" The voice was calm, familiar, and impossibly close. My stomach dropped. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. I forced myself to look. He was sitting across from me, in the same booth, leaning back casually with his arms crossed. That same faint smile played on his lips, like he was enjoying every second of this. "You're looking tired," he said, tilting his head slightly. "Rough day?" I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. My throat felt dry, like I hadn't spoken in days. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You can't keep running, Alex. You know that, right?" I finally found my voice, though it came out hoarse. "What do you want from me?" His smile faded. For the first time, his expression was serious, almost disappointed. "You're still asking the wrong questions." "What does that even mean?" I snapped, my frustration boiling over. He sighed, shaking his head like a parent disappointed in a child. "It means this isn't about what I want. It's about what you've been ignoring." I stared at him, my mind racing. "Ignoring? What are you talking about?" He leaned back again, his eyes locked on mine. "Think, Alex. Think about who you really are. About what you've done. You've spent so much time pretending, but deep down, you know the truth." I shook my head, backing into the corner of the booth. "No, you're lying. You're not real. You're just enough." His voice cut through me like a blade, low and cold. "Stop running. Stop lying to yourself. You can't change what happened. You can't erase it." My chest tightened, my vision blurring. "What are you talking about? I don't understand." He stood up, towering over me. "Yes, you do." And then he was gone. The diner was silent, the other customers oblivious to what had just happened. I was alone again, trembling in the booth, his words echoing in my head. "You can't change what happened. You can't erase it." I left the diner in a daze, the world outside feeling unreal, like I was walking through a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. His words churned in my mind, relentless. "You can't change what happened. You can't erase it." What had I done? What was he talking about? I wandered aimlessly, the cold night air biting at my skin. The streets blurred together, my thoughts spiraling. I couldn't keep doing this, running, hiding, pretending it wasn't happening. I needed answers. By the time the sun began to rise, I found myself standing outside my old college campus. The sight of it stopped me in my tracks. I hadn't been there in years, hadn't even thought about the place since I graduated. And yet here I was. It was as if my feet had carried me there on their own, guided by some unseen force. Or maybe by him. I hesitated at the entrance, staring up at the familiar buildings. Memories flooded back. Friends, classes, late nights cramming for exams. But beneath those memories was something darker, something I'd buried so deep I thought I'd never have to face it again. Swallowing hard, I stepped inside. The campus was quiet, almost eerie in the early morning light. I wandered the pathways, unsure of what I was looking for, until I found myself outside the library. And there he was. He was standing at the top of the stairs, watching me. There was no smug smile this time, no cryptic words, just silence. I forced myself to climb the stairs, my legs heavy with each step. When I reached him, he turned and walked inside without a word. I followed. The library was empty, the air thick with the smell of old books and dust. He led me through the maze of shelves until we reached a small study room at the back. The room was exactly as I remembered it. The same table, the same chairs, the same faint scratches on the walls. My stomach twisted as I stepped inside. He closed the door behind me, leaning against it. "Do you remember now?" he asked, his voice quiet. I shook my head, my chest tightening. "No, I don't know what you're talking about." He sighed, his expression unreadable. "You've spent so much time convincing yourself it never happened. But you can't hide from it anymore." I stared at him, my hands trembling. "What are you talking about? What did I do?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He handed it to me, his eyes never leaving mine. I unfolded it slowly, my breath catching as I saw what it was. A photo. It was me sitting at that very table, years ago, but I wasn't alone. There was someone else in the photo, a friend from college. Someone I hadn't thought about in years. Someone whose name I had deliberately erased from my life. I felt the walls of the room closing in as the memories came flooding back. Things I had buried. Things I had forced myself to forget. I sank into the chair, clutching the photo, the weight of it crushing me. He stood there, silent, as I began to remember everything. The memories hit me like a tidal wave, too powerful to stop. It was my first year of college. The person in the photo, Evan, had been my roommate. We weren't just roommates. We'd been close, inseparable almost. Late night talks, shared jokes, plans for the future. He was the kind of person who made everything seem lighter, easier. But there was one night I had tried to erase, one night that had haunted me in flashes and fragments ever since. I closed my eyes, clutching the photo, as the memory rose to the surface, sharp and vivid. It was late, past midnight. We were in this same study room, cramming for exams. Evan had always been better at staying focused, while I'd fidget and procrastinate. I remember feeling frustrated, jealous even, as he breezed through equations I couldn't even begin to understand. "You've just got to relax, Alex," he said, laughing. "Overthinking is your worst enemy." I snapped at him, something petty and mean, something I couldn't even remember now. He laughed it off, but I could tell it stung. That was the thing about Evan. He always tried to keep the peace, even when he didn't have to. But then things got heated. The argument spiraled out of control, words flying back and forth, sharp and cutting. I was angry, tired, embarrassed by my own shortcomings. He tried to de-escalate, but I wouldn't let it go. And then it happened. I slammed my hand down on the table, knocking over a glass of water. It spilled onto his laptop, soaking the keyboard. Evan jumped back, swearing, and in my frustration, I just stood there, watching as he tried to save it. "Great, Alex," he muttered, his voice tense. "Thanks a lot." Instead of apologizing, I lashed out again. "Maybe if you weren't such a know-it-all, this wouldn't have happened." He looked at me, hurt flashing across his face. He grabbed his things and stormed out without another word. I didn't follow him. I didn't apologize. I didn't know that would be the last time I'd ever see him. My throat tightened as the memory ended, my chest heaving with the weight of it. Tears blurred my vision as I looked up at him, my double, still standing by the door, watching me silently. "It wasn't my fault," I whispered, though the words felt hollow, even to me. "I didn't know." "You didn't know," he repeated, his voice low and cold. "That's the story you've told yourself for years, isn't it? That it wasn't your fault, that you had no idea he was struggling." My breath caught. Struggling. Evan had been dealing with things I hadn't noticed. Or maybe I had, and I just ignored them. He always brushed it off with a joke, always seemed like the happy, carefree one. But I hadn't seen the cracks beneath the surface. I hadn't seen how much he was hurting. He didn't come back to the dorm that night, my double said, stepping closer. "You went to bed angry, didn't you? And when you woke up, he was gone?" I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "Stop it, please." "But you didn't stop, Alex. You didn't ask questions. You didn't check on him. You didn't even call." His voice grew sharper, cutting through me, You told yourself it wasn't your problem. You moved on. You erased him. No, I screamed, clutching the photo. That's not true. I didn't. You did, he said, his voice now a whisper. And I'm here because you can't keep running from it. I sat there, shaking, the photo crumpled in my hands. My double didn't move, his presence pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. I didn't mean for it to happen, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I didn't know. He tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Didn't you? I flinched. The memories were clearer now than they'd ever been. I remembered the way Evan's jokes had turned quieter in the weeks leading up to that night. The way he seemed more distracted, like he was carrying something heavy he couldn't talk about. I'd noticed it, but I'd ignored it. I told myself it wasn't my problem, that he'd work through it on his own. And then he didn't. You never even went to the memorial, did you? My double said, his voice cold and steady. You couldn't face it. You dropped out of that class, moved to a different dorm, changed your routine. You buried it so deep you thought it would disappear. But it didn't. I didn't. I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. Why are you doing this? I demanded, my voice breaking. What do you want from me? He stepped closer, his eyes locking onto mine. For the first time, I could see the anger there, simmering just beneath the surface. I don't want anything from you, Alex, he said. This isn't about what I want. It's about what you owe. Oh, I repeated, my voice trembling. I can't go back and fix it. I can't. No, he interrupted. You can't. But you can stop lying to yourself. You can stop pretending you're innocent. My breath hitched. I didn't. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. You let him fall, Alex. And you didn't even look back. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stumbled back, my legs buckling beneath me. He didn't follow. He just stood there, watching, as if waiting for something. For what felt like hours, I sat on the floor, my head in my hands, drowning in the memories, the guilt, the crushing weight of everything I'd tried to forget. When I finally looked up, he was gone. I don't know how long I stayed in that room, staring at the empty space where he'd stood. The silence felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. And for the first time, I truly felt alone. Not the kind of loneliness that comes from being without people, but the kind that comes from knowing you've abandoned yourself. I left the library as the sun began to rise, my body numb, my mind raw. The city streets were waking up, filled with the usual rush of cars and people, but I felt like a ghost, drifting through a world that no longer recognized me. When I got back to my apartment, I barely noticed the chaos. Papers were scattered across the floor, drawers hung open, and my belongings were in disarray, like someone had torn the place apart. But I knew it wasn't someone else. It was me, or rather him. On the coffee table was another photo, placed carefully in the center. My hand shook as I picked it up. It was me again, this time at work, standing at my desk. My coworkers were around me, smiling, laughing. But I wasn't smiling. I was standing there, stiff and distant, like I didn't belong. I flipped the photo over, and on the back was another message. It's your turn to let go. The meaning hit me immediately, sharp and undeniable. He wasn't just taking over my life. He wanted me to give it to him. I laughed bitterly, the sound hollow in the empty apartment. What did I have left to hold on to? My friends didn't trust me anymore. My coworkers avoided me. Even my memories felt like they didn't belong to me anymore. Maybe he was right. Maybe I didn't belong here. That night, I sat in the apartment, waiting. The hours stretched endlessly, but I knew he would come. He always did. It was just past midnight when I heard the knock at the door. I didn't check the peephole. I didn't ask who it was. I just opened the door, and there he was, standing there with that same calm expression. I'm ready, I said, my voice steady for the first time in weeks. Take it. He didn't respond. He simply stepped inside, brushing past me as if he owned the place. I watched as he walked into the apartment, sitting down on the couch like it was his home. And then I left. I walked out into the night, my body light, my mind quiet. I didn't know where I was going, and I didn't care. Behind me, the lights in the apartment stayed on, casting a faint glow into the street. And as I walked, I couldn't help but wonder, had I escaped him? Or had he escaped me? I don't know what's real anymore. I'm writing this story to understand whether I've gone crazy or if something truly unexplainable has happened to me. This is my last hope. If anyone has been through something similar, if anyone knows what's happening, I need to know, because if I'm not me anymore, then who am I? Like this story? If it scared you as much as it scared us, make sure to give it a like. And if you've experienced something strange or unexplainable, send your story to the email in the description. We'd love to hear it.